I've never liked homeowners associations. I always saw them as nothing more than glorified neighborhood mafias, and that view only deepened after living under their thumb for years. I grew up in a neighborhood where the HOA was obsessive to the point of absurdity. They would fine residents for having their trash bins out 5 minutes too early or for coiling a garden hose the wrong way. If your lawn was an inch too tall or if your driveway had the smallest oil stain, you'd find yourself slapped with a violation notice. It was maddening, the way they controlled every little detail of our lives, all while masquerading as a community service organization. By the time I bought the farmhouse, I had spent years living in places that felt like prison cells. Not literally, of course, but in those neighborhoods where everything was too perfect, controlled, artificial, and suffocating. My childhood home was the epitome of that. I grew up in a subdivision where every house looked the same, just in different shades of beige or gray. The grass was always neatly trimmed, but no one actually lived in their yards. Kids played on driveways because the backyards were too small to do much of anything, and neighbors waved but rarely talked. It wasn't a bad place, but it was sterile and lifeless in a way I couldn't quite put into words back then. Our house fit right into that mold. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a perfectly paved driveway, and a backyard just big enough for a swing set but not much else. My parents were practical people. My dad worked in insurance, my mom did bookkeeping, and our life was as predictable as a clock. Most people would probably find that comforting, but even as a kid, I knew I wanted something more. I wanted freedom. I just didn't know what that looked like until I visited my grandfather's farm. My grandpa's farm was a few hours away from the city, and while it wasn't anything fancy, it felt like a different world entirely. It was a modest homestead, an old house with creaky wooden floors, doors that didn't close quite right, and a porch swing that groaned under its own weight. There was a barn, a couple of cows, and acres of untamed land stretching out as far as the eye could see. It was the complete opposite of where I grew up. The house wasn't perfect, but it felt alive in a way that beige suburban subdivisions never could. When I visited, I wasn't stuck indoors watching TV or playing video games like I was back home. I was outside, running through the fields, climbing trees, helping my grandpa mend fences, or sitting on the porch while he whittled wood and told stories about the good old days. He never defined what the good old days were, but from the way he talked, I figured they involved a lot of sweat, dirt, and self-reliance. That didn't sound so bad to me. At night, the sky out there was different. Back home, the stars were barely visible between the streetlights and the city's glow. But out at the farm, it was like someone had thrown a handful of glitter across the universe. I used to sit on the front steps and stare at the sky, trying to count the stars. It was the first time I truly understood what peace felt like. The visits to my grandpa's farm weren't just a change of scenery, they were my first real taste of freedom. Back in the suburbs, every day was mapped out. There was school, homework, dinner, and an endless list of chores. Everything followed the same, rigid routine. But on the farm, the days felt limitless. There was no schedule dictating what we had to do and no nagging reminders about taking out the trash or raking leaves just the right way. My grandpa had chores, of course, but they didn't feel like drudgery. If anything, they felt like adventures. Feeding the cows meant trudging through knee-high grass and watching the sun rise over the fields. Fixing fences meant using old tools and learning the patience that came with getting your hands dirty. It wasn't just the physical space that felt different, it was the mental space. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. There were no HOA rules to follow or neighborhood gossip to avoid. I could just be myself, with no expectations or pretenses. And that kind of freedom was addicting. When I returned to the suburbs after those visits, everything felt dull and suffocating. I'd sit in my perfectly trimmed backyard, staring at the wooden fence that boxed us in, and all I could think about was the farm. I knew I didn't belong in a place where conformity was the goal and individuality was discouraged. But at the time, I didn't know how to break free. As I got older, the pressure to follow the normal path only intensified. Go to college, get a degree, land a stable job, buy a house, start a family. That was the plan, and everyone around me seemed to be following it without question. So, I went along with it. I enrolled in business school, not because I had any passion for it, but because it seemed like a safe bet. I got decent grades, landed an office job right out of college, and moved into a tiny apartment in the city. On the surface, everything looked fine. I was ticking off all the boxes I was supposed to. But inside, I felt hollow. My days were spent staring at spreadsheets and attending mind-numbing meetings, and my nights were spent in a cramped apartment that never really felt like home. The city was noisy, crowded, and impersonal. There was no room to breathe, no stars to see at night, and no sense of peace. I felt like I was living someone else's life, a life that had been planned for me before I even had a chance to figure out what I wanted. Every now and then, I'd escape to the farm for a weekend visit. Those trips became my lifeline. As soon as I stepped onto that familiar porch, the weight of the city lifted off my shoulders. I'd sit with my grandpa, listening to his stories and soaking in the quiet. He never told me what to do with my life, but I could tell he understood what I was feeling. He'd been a city boy once too, before he traded it all for the simplicity of farm life. The turning point came one particularly stressful weekend. Work had been a nightmare, deadlines piling up, bosses breathing down my neck, and office politics that made me want to scream. By Friday afternoon, I was ready to snap. Instead of heading home, I packed a bag and drove straight to the farm. That night, my grandpa and I sat on the porch, watching the stars. I told him everything, how miserable I was, how trapped I felt, and how I didn't see a way out. He listened quietly, then gave me a piece of advice I'll never forget. Sometimes, he said, you have to burn the old map to find your own path. The simplicity of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd spent my entire life following a map that someone else had drawn. I'd been so focused on doing what was expected of me that I'd never stopped to think about what I actually wanted. And what I wanted was simple. I wanted freedom. I wanted space to breathe, work that felt meaningful, and a life that didn't revolve around HOA rules and corporate deadlines. It took a few months to summon the courage, but I finally made the leap. I quit my job, sold my apartment, and used my savings to buy a small farmhouse a few towns over from my grandpa's place. It wasn't much, a fixer-upper with peeling paint, creaky floors, and a barn that looked like it might collapse at any moment. But it was mine. There was no HOA to tell me what color to paint the walls or how to arrange my flower beds. I could plant wildflowers if I wanted to, or let the grass grow as tall as I liked. The first few months were a whirlwind of adjustments. Moving from the city to the countryside was a bigger culture shock than I'd expected. There were no late-night takeout options, no coffee shops on every corner, and no convenience stores open 24/7. But what I gained in return was worth more than any of those things. I woke up to the sound of birds instead of car horns. I spent my days working on the house, mending fences, and learning how to care for the land. And at night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars, just like I had when I was a kid. Of course, life in the countryside wasn't without its challenges. One morning, a few months after I'd moved in, I noticed a group of strangers standing at the edge of my property. They were dressed in business casual attire, an odd sight in a rural area, and carried clipboards and cameras. As I approached, one of them introduced herself as the president of the local HOA. I was confused. I hadn't signed up for any HOA, and as far as I knew, my property wasn't part of any neighborhood association. But the woman insisted that my farmhouse fell within their jurisdiction and that I was in violation of several rules. My grass was too tall, my fence was the wrong color, and my barn was in disrepair. I felt a familiar surge of frustration, the same frustration I'd felt all those years in the suburbs. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I calmly informed the woman that I wasn't a member of their HOA, nor did I have any intention of joining. My property was privately owned, and I had no obligation to follow their rules. She didn't take it well. She threatened to call the authorities, claiming that my property was a nuisance to the neighborhood. I stood my ground, knowing I was within my rights. And when the sheriff arrived, he sided with me. The HOA had no legal authority over my land. That encounter solidified my decision. I had left the suburbs for a reason, and I wasn't about to let anyone take away my hard-won freedoms. After my showdown with the HOA, I felt a new sense of independence that I hadn't known before. It was more than just standing my ground. It was about reclaiming control over my life and my choices. The feeling of empowerment stayed with me as I worked to restore my farmhouse. Every brushstroke of fresh paint and every repaired floorboard felt symbolic of the changes I was making within myself. For the first time, I began to see the beauty in imperfection. The chipped paint, the creaky barn door, and the overgrown garden weren't flaws, they were signs of life. They were reminders that I didn't need to fit a mold or conform to anyone's idea of perfection. Living in the city and the suburbs had taught me that many people focus too much on appearances. They strive to maintain pristine lawns and spotless homes because they're afraid of judgment. But on the farm, nature didn't care about appearances. The seasons changed without permission, wildflowers bloomed wherever they pleased, and the wind carried leaves across the fields without regard for neatly manicured borders. Embracing this way of life gave me a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. As idyllic as it sounds, life on the farm came with its own set of challenges. I quickly learned that farming wasn't just about peaceful sunsets and fresh air. It was about hard, physical labor and constant problem-solving. Every day brought a new challenge: broken equipment, unexpected storms, or pest infestations that threatened the crops I had painstakingly planted. At first, I was overwhelmed. There were so many things I didn't know how to do, and I was constantly making mistakes. I overwatered the vegetable garden, leading to a root rot problem that killed half my crops. I tried to fix the barn roof on my own, only to have it collapse under my weight. And I couldn't figure out how to keep the deer from eating the fruit trees I had just planted. But every mistake was a lesson. I learned to reach out to my grandpa and the local farming community for advice. Slowly, I began to get the hang of things. My hands grew calloused, my muscles ached in ways they never had before, but I felt stronger and more capable with each passing day. One of the things I hadn't anticipated was how much I would come to rely on the local farming community. In the city, neighbors rarely talked to one another. Everyone was too busy rushing from one obligation to the next to stop and make meaningful connections. But out here, things were different. When my barn roof caved in, a neighbor showed up with a toolbox and spent the entire day helping me repair it. When I lost half my crops, a local farmer offered me seedlings to replant. And when I struggled to figure out how to keep the deer away, someone dropped off a homemade deterrent at my doorstep. These acts of kindness weren't transactional, they were genuine expressions of community. And as I got to know the people around me, I realized how much I had missed this sense of connection. It wasn't just about helping each other in times of need, it was about sharing meals, swapping stories, and being there for one another through the ups and downs of life. One of the unexpected benefits of leaving behind the rigid structure of city life was that it gave me the mental space to rediscover my creativity. As a kid, I had loved painting and writing, but those passions had been pushed aside as I focused on school, work, and other practical pursuits. Now that I had more time and fewer distractions, I found myself picking up a paintbrush again. I set up a small studio in the farmhouse, where I spent rainy afternoons creating landscapes inspired by the surrounding fields and forests. I also started journaling regularly, capturing my thoughts and experiences in a way that helped me process the changes I was going through. Creativity became a form of therapy for me, a way to express the things I couldn't always put into words. It reminded me that life wasn't just about productivity and achievement. It was about finding joy in the little moments and creating something beautiful from the chaos. While life on the farm was more fulfilling than anything I had experienced before, it wasn't without its challenges. There were days when I felt isolated, especially during the long winter months when the fields were covered in snow and the roads were difficult to navigate. There were times when I missed the convenience of city life, the ability to order takeout or run to the store at a moment's notice. But over time, I learned to find balance. I made an effort to stay connected with friends and family, even if it meant driving into town for the occasional dinner or phone call. I also learned to embrace the slower pace of life, finding joy in simple pleasures like baking bread, reading by the fire, or watching the snow fall from my window. One of the most profound lessons I learned on the farm was the importance of living in harmony with nature. In the city, nature often felt like something to be controlled or tamed. Lawns were mowed to perfection, gardens were pruned with precision, and every fallen leaf was immediately swept away. But on the farm, I learned to appreciate nature's wildness. I watched as the seasons changed, each one bringing its own unique beauty and challenges. Spring brought new life and fresh beginnings, while summer was a time of growth and abundance. Fall was a season of harvest and preparation, and winter was a time of rest and reflection. Living in tune with these natural rhythms helped me develop a deeper sense of patience and acceptance. I realized that not everything could be planned or controlled, and that was okay. One summer afternoon, a few old friends from the city decided to visit the farm. They were curious about the life I had built and wanted to see it for themselves. As they arrived, I couldn't help but notice the contrast between their fast-paced energy and the slow, steady rhythm of the farm. At first, they seemed out of place, checking their phones every few minutes, complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi, and making jokes about roughing it. But as the day went on, something shifted. They put their phones away, rolled up their sleeves, and helped me harvest vegetables from the garden. We sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset and sharing stories. By the time they left, they admitted that they could see why I had made the change. One friend even joked, "I might have to move out here myself someday." One of the most rewarding moments of my journey came with my first successful harvest. After months of hard work, the garden was finally flourishing. The vegetable beds were overflowing with ripe tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and vibrant bell peppers. The fruit trees were heavy with apples, and the herb garden was fragrant with basil and thyme. Harvesting the fruits of my labor was a deeply satisfying experience. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the journey. Every bite was a reminder of the mistakes I had made, the lessons I had learned, and the resilience I had developed along the way. Perhaps the most important lesson I learned on the farm was the value of letting go of perfection. In the city and the suburbs, there was constant pressure to present a flawless image, to have the perfect job, the perfect home, and the perfect life. But perfection is an illusion, and chasing it only leads to stress and dissatisfaction. On the farm, I learned to embrace imperfection. I didn't care if the garden was a little overgrown or if the barn still had a few broken boards. What mattered was the life I was building, the freedom, the peace, and the sense of purpose that came with it. Looking back on my journey, I'm grateful for every step that led me here, the struggles, the setbacks, and the moments of doubt. Each experience taught me something valuable and helped me grow into the person I am today. I no longer feel trapped by societal expectations or the pressure to conform. I found a life that's authentic to who I am, a life filled with creativity, community, and connection to the land. And while the journey is far from over, I know that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be.